Hello. So, if you've spent any time with me, you know I love to talk about these best places to invest in short term rental lists that come out. And I am a fan. I think they can be very inspirational, but I think that if we're not doing our own due diligence, we shouldn't take these too seriously, right? I think they're a great source of inspiration. And I will freely admit that I actually did get inspired to look at a market where I eventually did purchase based on one of these lists. But I always like to take a deep dive. So why don't you take a deep dive in with me, and we're going to walk through some of the factors behind these lists, and also to take a look at a property in the top recommended market by AirDNA. So let us go here. So when these companies put together these lists, and there are many companies that put these lists out, you all know, if you've spent time with me, that I love AirDNA. They've been around the longest. I think they stay in their lane pretty well in terms of being a data clearinghouse and presenting that data back to us in helpful ways, right? But data is as data does, and we need to always err on the side of caution and not make decisions based on data alone. So when these lists come out, AirDNA in particular for this list tells us that the top 5 things they really looked at are what has been demand for short-term rentals in this market over the last 12 months, how has revenue growth changed, how investable is it? So they're going to look at what properties are for sale and how much they cost. They're going to look at the regulatory environment, and then a number of market performance metrics that if you are a user of a service like AirDNA, you are familiar with, like listing numbers of listings, revenue potential changes, occupancy rates, all of those things. But I think as we, as the investors think about this, some things that we need to be thinking about as we look at these. So this is the grain of salt, right? Supply versus demand. So we know supply versus demand. We've been looking and watching the stabilization of more supply. I just lost a view here. Okay, let me just make sure we're good. All right, so for supply has been outstripping demand since 2021, 2022, and the good news is we're actually seeing supply slow, which is going to give it a chance to catch up to demand, which is growing. It's just we've been outpacing it, right? But I also think it's important in some of these markets to look at supply versus demand in that market, right? And if we all of a sudden get a glut of new people investing in a market because it's the number one city on the list, how is that going to shift the dynamic in that market? Because again, data is looking backwards. So we need to look forwards. And we're going to do some of this over the next few minutes here. The next thing I like to think about is these lists typically use the average cost of housing versus the cost of housing good for short-term renting. Now, this is going to be variable depending on your market. And frankly, you can take a potato and throw it down in a field and turn it into something good for short-term rentals. But in general, the average cost of housing, average houses are not often great for short-term rentals, right? We want something that kind of stands out a little bit. Those tend to cost more, or they're in premium locations that cost more. So using the average cost of housing in a marketplace is, while an indicator, we don't want to go to the bank on that, right? So the next thing that we want to think about is regulations. And this is honestly, anytime I look at a place anymore, I look at regulations. And as I looked at AirDNA's list just last week, I posted on social about how I had looked at some properties for a client. And I, as I always do, started with regulations to make sure that we were covered. And one of the cities I looked at was actually Crescent City, California, which is number 5 on AirDNA's list. They have a owner residency requirement to short-term rent. So unless you're planning on living in Crescent City, California, that is not actually a great place to invest, okay? And then next on the list, man, I should have fixed this animation, sorry. as I just referenced the potato in the field, we also know that as much as these lists can be inspirational, as much as you can look at markets that feel, we'll use the term saturated, which is where supply, has outstripped demand, and the result has been a decrease in overall revenue per unit. But a skillfully positioned, marketed, and managed property can stand out in any market, right? So we don't want to be too imprisoned by the idea that there's a best market, because it's really about the property and how well positioned, marketed, and managed it is, okay? And then finally, just another point to think about as we do our own due diligence, what are the available resources? As many of these lists are pushing into secondary markets and rural markets, if you're going to put in a hot tub and you don't live there, are there people in the marketplace that are actually willing to clean it, that have experience cleaning it? Are you going to have to monitor them more closely? Do you have cleaners that understand a short-term rental turnover is not a residential cleaning? Are they willing to learn that, or do you have time to train that? So a lot of these lists, again, are pushing into secondary markets that don't have a lot of short-term rentals. Therefore, there are not a lot of trained resources or even available resources in these marketplaces to take care of these tasks. So those are just some things that I think about anytime I'm considering a market. And certainly as we look at these best places to invest, the data can't take all of these factors into account. So if we think about the number one on the list, it's Peoria, Illinois, with an average potential rental of about 31,000, and they've seen a 21% listing growth, which actually in such a small market makes me wonder, can demand sustain that, right? But it does have a 58.9% occupancy, and their ADR is about $179 with a RevPAR growth of 7.7%. So, the numbers do look nice. Who goes to Peoria? What's the draw in Peoria? So the first thing I'm wondering is, I'm going to go and look at Airbnb, like what's here, like what kind of houses and what do they have to offer me if I'm coming to Peoria and that. And so I immediately see, now I'm doing this in winter, which in Peoria, I also live in the Midwest, is not an ideal time to be going traveling. But all of these prices are quite low, as you can see, for the listings that are being offered in my search results. I do see the homes. They look nice, right? They look like they have nice levels of finish potentially. Of course, this is just the first 8 that showed up in my search results. So now I want to know, why do people come here? Who is the likely target audience here, right? And so I like to answer this question. There's many ways. I'll look at travel and tourism sites, TripAdvisor, all these things, but I love to download reviews left on many different kinds of short-term rentals, and then ask AI to summarize that and aggregate that data based on the comments that people leave in reviews. Why are they coming to this area? What are they doing while they're here? Where are they coming from? I ask AI all these questions to feed it back to me based on a whole bunch of reviews in a market. And so for this market, the number one most frequently mentioned thing was they were here visiting family or friends, and a lot of it was college related. So they're coming to drop off kids, they're coming for parent weekend, they're coming to visit kids, whatever. Business travel was another thing that was mentioned an awful lot. People coming in for events, conferences, weddings, things like that, or even just passing through. I'm looking for a place for passing through. So as I think about this and I think about the marketplace, this is clearly not a tourist market per se in a traditional vacation sense. We're not saying I'm going to go to Peoria for my week-long vacation and hang out there with my extended family. So that immediately lends me to think about what kind of housing would do well here as a short-term rental, probably smaller, right? And probably close to the things that they're looking to do, right? Peoria apparently has a very nice river frontage area that I would imagine would be very popular for folks coming to town. And then again, same process where it was looking at all the reviews, people who leave reviews, it tells you where they're from, right? And so all of the people that, were staying, or a large majority of them, were within driving distance, many of them from within the state of Illinois or the surrounding states. So this is a drive to location for people to come visit when they do come. Well, so what are the big economic drivers in this economy? And so I was able to determine, so healthcare is the biggest employer and the biggest driver of the economy. And here, shortly followed by manufacturing. This is, it turns out, I did not know, the home of the Caterpillar construction and mining equipment headquarters. Caterpillar, I think we all know that. So manufacturing is huge here. We're in the Midwest, we're in Illinois, agriculture and food. I also learned that this particular area, pumpkins and popcorn are the big exports from Peoria. And then logistics, there are, I think, 11 different railroad lines that come through here in 3 major interstates. So it's a really efficient place in terms of transportation logistics. So there's a big component of their economy. But nowhere on here is tourism part of the economy, right? So I think as we understand and think about the marketplace, this might be a place where doing a blend of short-term and midterm may be good as you get people coming into town for longer-term work assignments and things like that. But also maybe one-night stays is something that we want to consider in an economy like this, because again, if you've got people just passing through for a night, you want your place to be available. The other thing I like to know is what are people's options as they stay here? So, that can be difficult information to get, but there were at least 3 key hotel chains in this, in the downtown area with at least 800 rooms between them. So there is travel lodging and potentially, as we think about regulations, pushback from hotel lobbies in that area who don't want to see a bunch of short-term rentals in the downtown area. So that does make you curious, right, about regulations, which we'll talk about in a minute. So what does the short-term rental marketplace though look like in Peoria? So as AirDNA, noted, there's been a significant growth in the supply of short-term rentals. And as you can see by the map, I mean, they're not all right in the downtown along the river area, but you definitely have, all the way up, I'm sure views of the river are big. You get some folks over here in Princeville and, down here in some of the outlying markets. So using AirDNA data, again, the average annual revenue in this market is up about 9% at $24,000 is on average. Again, averages as average does. Occupancy is 55%, up 2%. The average daily rate of $153 and RevPAR is at $85. And especially in a market like this, I like to understand the distribution of offerings. And as you would expect in a marketplace like this, the largest majority are 1 bedrooms, and then shortly followed by 2 bedrooms, and then really diminishing 3, 4 bedrooms is only 5%, and 5+ bedrooms is only 3%. And my guess is larger bedroom homes probably don't do as well because that's not the kind of audience that's coming to this marketplace right now. You can do well, but I think if you get too many, then you're just you're not going to have enough business to really sustain that. So I always like to look at what's the top grossing property in the marketplace. And so this is, according to AirDNA, this is a property that has 15 bedrooms and sleeps 55, and its revenue potential is less than $130K a year. So, we're not dropping a lot of money. It does have fairly low occupancy, but it's getting, over $1,000 a night, which if you can house 55 people, that's a pretty big number, right? So let's look at a place for sale. And I was pretty shocked. There were many, many, many properties that were under $100,000 in this market. But if I'm buying in this market, I probably want to be in downtown and somewhere cool, right? So there's this condo for sale. It's just newly listed for sale at 109. And so I'm going to look at the regulations that might pertain to this particular property. So they do have short-term rental regulations. They have, if it is a non-owner occupied unit, then you have to register it as a rental. So that would apply to long-term or short-term. If you're non-owner occupied, there's additional process to apply. If you want to short-term rent, whether owner occupied or not, you also have to get a short-term rental permit. They actually refer to that as a hotel motel permit, which immediately puts me on edge because we are not hotel motel, and those permits are usually because you have a high density number of unrelated people staying in a place. But that's what they have. They do stipulate that special use approval may be required. I tried to dig into this a little more. I'm not going to spend all day doing this. I would advise you call them and figure out what that actually means. It looks like unless you're owner occupied, you're going to have to get a special use permit. And it appears that if you're not in residential zoning, even if you're in multi-use, you are going to have to get special use approval. They do have minimum occupancy standards and safety standards that apply, and they also have an additional tax, which appears to be about 8%. For this particular property, it is in a condo. You would want to verify any deed restrictions and whether or not short-term renting is allowed per the condo bylaws. So if you've spent any time with me, you've looked at any of my case studies, I always start with the back of the envelope. Is this worth my time? And in this case, the way that I do that is I figure out how much would my monthly mortgage payment be, and inclusive of my insurance, my taxes, and in this case, my $400 and some a month condo fee. So that brings us to just own the property, about $17,000 a year, including that rather steep for $100,000 condo fee. So my back of the envelope, I usually just use a multiplier to gauge likely expense amounts. Now, most of the time these days, I use a 0.4. So I say of my annual amount, another quarter, another 25% or so of that percent would be the expenses. So, but in this case, I'm suggesting, 0.3, 40%. So 1.4, so about 40% of my annual expenses, then again, as much in expenses. But for a condo, your expenses tend to be a little bit lower after you've paid your condo fee. So on condos like this, I like to use that multiplier of 30%. And so if I do that, that gives me a total back of the envelope of about $22,000 a year in expenses just to have this as a short-term rental. So AirDNA, if I put in the address, tells me that this 2-bed, 2-bath with a potential of up to 5 guests could generate about $24,000 a year at 61% occupancy. And if I go to Data Rabu, it actually tells me $10,585 a year. So that's a pretty big discrepancy between the two that you would definitely want to dig into a little bit more. So in AirDNA, I went back and looked at what is the top grossing property for this occupancy level. And here was, I thought it was a condo when I first saw it, but it turns out it's actually a house, and it's making $56,000 a year. It is the top grossing smaller property in this marketplace, and it is actually a house, not a condo. And as you can see, it has a lot of very unique features, a lot of nicely done property that would have a high level of appeal to people looking for this size property in the immediate downtown area. It is walkable to restaurants and things. It looks like it has a nice view. It doesn't look like it's right in the heart of things like the proposed condo that we're looking at might be, but I think this would be a strong contender. And at $56,000 a year, I think that does suggest that if you bought that condo and you wanted it, you might be able to push that price point up a little bit beyond that 24 just by up-leveling the interior. And so now we can look at the actual condo And it looks like you can actually, you've got a nice view. It's an upper floor condo. Nicely done. I think it's a little bit bland as a short-term rental if you really want to pop. I think you could just add some artwork. It's probably not sold furnished, so you're probably going to have to furnish it. But I think, you could make this something special and increase the occupancy, I'm thinking, again, if it's allowed as a short-term rental. So do the finances make sense? I mean, obviously we're not getting into a cash on cash. We haven't talked about ROI because frankly, once I hit the regulatory piece and I realized that this is not a township that is educated enough to appreciate that as a short-term rental owner, you don't need a hotel motel license. That would make me a little bit nervous. And I don't think that the reward on this would be big enough, but maybe there's some pretty inexpensive homes in this marketplace that I might consider. So I will at some point do an additional deep dive so that we can get into the cash on cash and all of that. And I'll get that posted in the next week. So if you want to get notified when I get that posted, leave hit the subscribe button and you will get notified. All right. Thanks for sticking around.